I mean, in the fall, we'll do, weighted glute ham eccentric drops. I mean, essentially a Nordic. But if that was the key for being fast and performance, Sue would have a hard time with 15 kilos. And I would put my female long jumper on there and she's knocking out 35 kilos, like nothing. And the guys are just staring at her like, what are you made of? Because we can't do that. And yet one could run 11.6, the other can run 10.0.
That was Randy Huntington, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's podcast is brought to you by our longtime sponsor, SimplyFaster.com. There's 2 items I'd like to talk to you about today that you can find in Simply Faster's online store. Whether you're a coach or an athlete, these are both things that you'll find highly useful as tools in your training toolbox. The first is blood flow restriction training methods. And after hearing about blood flow restriction training for years now, as well as the results that athletes are getting with it, especially in, for example, lactate sports like swimming, 100-meter freestyle, and not only hearing of that, but also seeing how much some swimmers had liked that type of training method, I knew I had to start trying it out myself. So I've been utilizing the air bands. I really enjoy it, both the feeling while I'm actually training with them, as well as seeing the visual result of spending time training with the methods and then the strength result. They've been a really cool training tool, and I would definitely recommend checking into air bands. SimplyFaster.com also has Be Strong brand blood flow restriction. The second item is the VMAX Pro, and this is a new option for velocity-based training, barbell tracking. It provides valuable load-based data, including speed in all phases of a lift, and it delivers key metrics such as power, velocity, distance, as well as duration of effort. The VMAX Pro system measures any lift you can think of. It's portable, durable, and intuitive. You can check out these 2 items and much more at our sponsor, SimplyFaster.com's online store. Let's get on to the show. Welcome to another episode. I've had the good fortune of having Randy Huntington, track and field coach, on over the last several months, twice. And Randy has had phenomenal success in his recent years as the national track and field coach for the Chinese Athletics Association. Amongst other great successes that Randy has had, Randy has coached Su Bingtian, who is the Asian record holder in the 100-meter dash, and en route to that 9.84 second record-breaking run, Su actually covered an estimated 40-yard dash as per NFL Combine timing specs in around 4.08 seconds. So basically blowing away the NFL Combine record. And over the last couple shows, Randy has been going into detail on some of the methods behind Su Bingtian and then Randy's training group, what they're doing for speed and power outputs, and so much great information. I've gotten such good feedback on those shows, and people have had a ton of questions about Randy's work. And so this show was an awesome opportunity, not only to get Randy back on again, but also to hear what you guys wanted to hear from him. So what questions did you have for Randy? I put out a call for questions on social media, got a ton back. Sorry, we didn't, this show, even though it's an hour and a half long, we were not able to get through all of them, but we were able to get through many. And some of the common themes that Randy will be answering to your questions will be traditional strength methods for speed and power development, Randy's specific speed training workouts. So what is he specifically like for acceleration, specifically like for maximal velocity? And then what does that look like over a period of weeks? He'll be talking about coaching relaxation and sprint technique. And he'll also be talking about the ever debated Nordic hamstring exercise. What is his take on that? And he'll be talking about his thoughts on hamstring injury prevention training in general. You'll get this and much more in this wonderful question and answer episode. It was great to have Randy back on, and I'm sure you guys will really enjoy hearing his answers to all the questions that were put out. Let's get on to the show. Randy, welcome back to the show. It's awesome to have you back. I've had the good fortune of being able to have you on 2 times recently in the recent months, and I know I've had a lot of questions still for you coming off of those last shows, and I know a lot of other coaches out there have as well. So I'm excited to get you these questions today, and thanks for being back.
Well, thanks a lot. I mean, it's always good when we do these that it produces questions, because then that means people are actually, 1, paying attention, and 2, are looking at how to solve problems that they have. And that helps, when they ask these questions, it helps all of us think about potential solutions. And there is not one person who has all the answers to this. That's for sure. So as we go through some of these questions that you're going to ask me, be prepared for me to say, I'm not sure, or I don't know, or I can't be for sure. And part of that comes back to, Joel, what we talked about in the very first session, I believe, when I was referring to the fact that much of what we end up doing as you get a little bit older in this is pretty intuitive. You understand and feel it. You sometimes may not understand why you feel it. It's very difficult to get that across. You don't have to have everything written specifically in stone. It just sometimes is, and it's right. And sometimes you don't have some science for that. Science tells you later on why it's right. So it's interesting.
Yeah, something I've been thinking about lately is I had a post on my social media, and it was basically like the idea of developing your intuition. And in my reference was actually having a part of the training session that you didn't write out ahead of time just to force you to use. I mean, not just like you're going to do the whole week off the cuff and just make it up as you go, but just giving yourself some room to have to use intuition and have to synthesize something that you didn't just read off a page, and realizing that the answers are a little bit deeper than just surface level yes or no or do this exercise type thing.
And they are always deeper. I mean, it's I'm not going to say this the wrong way, but it's kind of like dating. As you get older, and when you're younger, you have this big list of things you want to find in someone. As you get older, that list gets very small, but really definite, So it's like, kind of have to have these this particular quality or this thing. Like for me, it'd be a smoker. Sorry, no smoking, things like that. So in training, you start to get down to the least common denominators. And particularly, as you've heard me state before, when you're coaching in a foreign language in which neither party has access to the other language, you do get down to the common truths. And same thing, I think, happens when you're coaching junior high. That's a great place in which to learn the common truths of your sport, because you can't complicate it. You've got to have it simple.
Yeah. I love that. It was, and we'll get these questions here. Just one more thing that had me think of that I thought was interesting is Jeremy Frisch in a recent recording was talking about some NFL or high college level coach ended up there was some competition where that high level coach had to take a youth team, like a bunch of, I don't know if it was like 10, 12-year-olds, and played another youth team. And this pro coach got his team's butt kicked when he went to training youth. And I just think it's so like, I'm always, that's just one kind of phase I'm in, is just seeing how important it is to be able to train different populations and things like that, and getting to the core of how do you train a person. Or even watching my children play with the neighbor's dog, I was thinking, well, how do you interact with an animal, and you can't even use words, and then kids and general principles, and then you go kind of up the chain from there.
Well, one of the books I bought and I looked at years and years and years ago was, of course, dog training. When I was growing up, we had a kennel and we trained dogs. And then later on, I looked at the book called The Horse Whisperer, which the movie was based on. And there's a lot in those books that can tell you about how to coach, and particularly when you're starting out with somebody new. And a lot of times you don't have the answers that you want to bring this person to the point they need to get to. But intuitively, you get on a path, and that path takes you someplace. You're wondering, where did that come from? How did I know that? And it's interesting. It's fun to do. It's fun to let your mind open up enough to reveal those pathways to your intuitive self.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've been thinking, like I was just thinking a couple days ago, and it might have been in lieu of watching my children play with the dog, was I've thought about having a guest on this podcast at some point that like trains horses. And in my mind, I'm like, I would love that. But I'm like, I don't know how many people are going to be interested in that, unfortunately. But it's like now, people like you say, hey, learn about animals, learn the basic levels of interaction, that even go
are even more foundational than words. And so it gives me more motivation to get to a podcast like that.
For me, I started out at Western Michigan where we had Psych 101, which was back then was psychology class that was all based on conditioning. It's back to training the rats in the lab. And, we did that and we learned Psych 101, George. God, I just forgot George's name. That's horrible. Anyways, famous professor. He's now passed away. But it was a real start to, well, at one level, dehumanizing the human, but at another level, getting to the basics of how you get people, motivate people to do something they may not want to do. Well, they want to do, but they may not want to do what it takes to do, So it's always it's always good to go back to those basic things and to understand that some things you were learning in a classroom in college has no meaning to you until years later you go, oh my gosh, there's that tension I was looking for, and you pull it back in and it's there for you. And that's why I think liberal arts education can be very, very provocative, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, I could talk to you about this level of coaching forever, but I got so many questions from coaches, Randy, and I'm excited to see how many we can get through. You had mentioned some of these answers with being able to get a definitive answer. I know the first question's a brain buster. And there a few people asked this, but it was Coach Hughes and someone else said basically, if you didn't have access to a seated Keiser, and just context people who didn't hear the last ones, use the seated Keiser to assess the lower leg power outputs, how would you assess or train calf and foot strength?
You couldn't really assess the soleus by itself, which is what the seated calf is doing. But you could use another seated calf, mass-based seated calf device, although you're still stuck at the speed of gravity and it's pretty slow, which is not necessarily a bad thing. What you could do is do mass elastic combination, but you'd have to figure that one out because it's rough, and you still aren't going to have power output. But you could potentially throw a VMAX Pro or something on there and come up with some rough idea of what you're getting. Is even if it's not perfect, it would, if it's consistent and fairly reliable, then you could utilize something else within the arm of the machine or whatever it may be to set a standard for improvement in a seated calf. You have to do the seated calf to get the soleus, so you can't do it any other way. Just the way it is.
I'm laughing in my head thinking about being at kind of the Planet Fitness type gym, and you have the VMAX Pro on the end of a seated calf and are trying to blast out reps. It's kind of funny, but I think that's awesome. I think whoever's out there with it, should try that and post your VMAX Pro on social media with the seated calf and see what numbers you come up with.
Yeah, you throw a VMAX Pro on the end on the bar, where you have to wait, and just get a little stand and throw your iPad up there or your phone and watch it. And if you do it with mass, you're going to see different results than if you did it with air, and you're going to see a different result than if you do it with mass and elastic. Now, your soleus is very strong, but for most people, it's quite weaker than it should be. So elastic, you might even only need a 15 kilo band, because you're going to have to roll it over once or twice, put it under the stand or something and bring it back up and attach it. 15, 25, 20, people can play with it, but that's the only other way you could get close to what you get with the Keiser seated calf.
Cool. Yeah. I'd be interested. Okay. It makes sense. You really can't get around that air power. I'm kind of thinking in my head too of you were talking about the Keisers. They almost throw you down in a way or something like that. The air power, it accelerates you faster than gravity. So I'm well, could you have some pushing down the seat lightweight, just throwing it down?
It not just it doesn't, sort of, it does. And actually, I've had a few coaches who just, and I need to make this clear now, Keiser has an eccentric, a very powerful eccentric. I've had coaches say, Keiser's good, but there's no eccentric to it. I'm like, are you talking about? Are you crazy? Have you been on one? Its eccentric can be incredibly powerful. And it's, yeah, so we need to make that clear. Keiser is a concentric eccentric device. So it's not like a hydraulic piece, which is concentric. And people confuse the view of a cylinder and think it's hydraulic, and it's not. It's pneumatic.
Cool. Next question here is from Derek Hansen, and he asked your thoughts on this could be like the whole show here, so we might have to narrow it down, but like thoughts on your approach to strength and resistance training for sprinting and speed development. I guess if I put my narrowing spin on it, just to get through some more of the other questions, I would say, could you maybe specifically address one, lifting without the like if you don't have Keiser, like what's the next best, and two, it's been people will debate just different little things till the end of time, but your take on Olympic lifts, I think it's and maybe Olympic lifts in different populations, like even team sports. I mean, obviously if you have a Keiser, right, like isn't that so much simpler? But so I'd be curious on strength if you don't have a Keiser, and then thoughts on the Olympic lift specifically versus like a hex bar jump or something else in the program.
Oh, that's a big question, really big question.
Yeah,
and Derek asked really big questions and good ones. So my take on strength training, and let's just say in track and field for a little bit, I try not to do too hard a strength training until people are able to execute the technical component I want them to execute. Unless that technical component, of course, desires strength or is needed in order for it to happen. So I don't look at strength training initially as a way to create anything, because I want them to first get their body able to move through the positions, through the actions that are necessary to execute it properly. Then we start adding strength onto that. And, we could go into all kinds of systems, for gosh sakes. There's so many out there. I basically, and have for years, either do a tri or a quad system, very similar probably to what Minnesota used to do. I'm still a little bit of old school probably, but it's worked for so many years, where I'll do a heavy lift or a medium lift, followed by a heavy lift, followed by a light lift, followed by an unloaded lift, unloaded movement. So I'm moving through the spectrum of speed in 3 to 4 different lifts, and I'll do 2 circuits of that, meaning 2 different styles of that per session. And that's kind of the gist of what we're doing. We get very strong, but we get very fast and powerful too. So to answer your question about the Olympic lifts, when you look at the Olympic lifts, the time frame, it really only affects us in the very, very beginning of the start, coming out of the blocks, for instance. After that, it's just remarkably slow compared to everything else we do. This is why your conversation with Rolf Ullmann is going to be pretty vital, I think, to start to understand some of the things. And I'm leaving that up to Rolf to do, because we can get into a series of definitions here that would confuse everybody. And you do need to kind of have that done by itself so that people start to rethink what we're doing in the weight room. I've used Keiser, as you know, since 1983. It's part of my DNA. It sets us apart, did set us apart, because nobody else was using it. Now Raina's using it, and a few of the other elite coaches are. Tanja Buford's using it down in Texas with her group there. And there's going to be more. I just think that we misunderstand. We still interpret power as force only. And, although for years, in my world, for years, we've known power is not just force. But I think it still happens more often than not, mostly because we haven't had very effective ways to test it. And I think force platforms are obviously a great way to go through testing some of these, something that you can do. We do what's called a drop squat with the Keiser squat, and we'll have 220 kilos on that, and we basically drop down into a squat position. So we bring our feet off the ground and we drop in. Then we have this incredibly eccentric hold, but we turn it right around fast. And the amount of power involved in changing the direction of a 200 kilos of air is amazing. And it's so much more than mass alone, so much more. And when you do the same thing with mass and air together, the amount of power you're producing is so much greater than mass alone or air alone, let's say, with a bar. So the two together give you the best blend on let's say, a Keiser half rack or Keiser rack. And we do spend a lot of time in that world, air mass combination. And, you could have a good discussion with University of Indiana strength coach who was at Michigan, Aaron Wellman. You could have a good discussion with Aaron about how he discovered this back when he was at Michigan and what his thoughts were. And he would be better at the team sports side than I am, just because he's had more opportunity.
Cool. Yeah, I know that could be a question that there's like infinite ways to go with that question. So I'll just leave that there because I know, there's a lot of other ones.
Really big question, and it would take a while to answer. I know that tomorrow they're doing the exact same question in another group dealing with 400 meter training, and I can't be on that call, but it's a great question, and like I said, Derek is always looking for the answers, and I really appreciate the questions he does ask.
Quickly, I wanted to let you know about the chance to try out Performance Herbalism for only a few dollars shipping costs and get one of Lost Empire Herbs' flagship products, Pine Pollen, for free. Switching to an herbal emphasis in my supplementation has been a life-changing switch for me. Just as nature is by design balanced and sustainable, I believe that the more natural our diet and our supplementation is, the better. I love and use several Lost Empire Herbs products that boost not only my energy, but also my strength. These include Shilajit resin and the Phoenix formula. You could check those out by heading to lostempireherbs.com/justfly and grab 15% off. If you're on the fence about the power of herbalism, I have a great offer for you, which is that you can get free. You do pay a few dollars shipping, but you can get free Pine Pollen. Pine Pollen is an herbal powerhouse that is a hormonal and energy booster packed with nutrition. It's actually part of the Phoenix formula, and you can get that for free along with the normal shipping fee at justflypinepollen.com. All right, let's get back to the show. Yeah, next one, so kind of not the opposite, but it's all related. But example, Cody Bidlow is asking for, and he has 3 of them, so I think I might, in light of time, I'll shoot you 2 of these. But example, speed and speed endurance sessions. I'm sure this could be all over the place. So maybe this training max velocity or acceleration with some different groups. If you just want to go through a few of your kind of favorite sets, the way you like to kind of lay that out for athletes.
Well, in acceleration, typically we're doing resisted followed by unloaded. So my basic pattern is heavy sled, 50% of body weight or higher, and then on to 1080, in which we're using maybe 15 to 20% body weight, and then unloaded after that. And we'll be right in the blocks and we'll go. Now, as you're doing that, they're going to be a little slow for a while because they have to adapt to all that work. But we're really I'm not so worried about time or all that. I'm really doing that to work on block clearance, first 4 steps, basically. And then the rest of it comes later. So that's how I start with acceleration. If I have a hill, I'll do a hill initially to prepare the legs a little bit, a fairly steep hill, relatively short, 15 meters or so. And then there's this debate, and I answered it in my own head a long time ago, but there's speed endurance, and then there's enduring speed. So a lot of what I do with the 100 meters is we endure speed, which means we get to max velocity and try to maintain max velocity as long as we can. So we're playing a lot in the 60 to 80 meter range, 85 meters, 90 meters. we're trying to get to that max velocity point and then hold that velocity as long as we can in a relaxed manner and whatever we can. Obviously, you can see Su's face. His body's relaxed, but his face isn't. And you could make a case for that might be okay. In his case, you don't, but he still hasn't figured that out. And we're working on it. And I'm hoping by this year, I was hoping last year I'd get it. I mean, he ran 9.83 tightest. You can see how tight he was, but he was relaxed through that 6:29. And so he thinks, and it's a problem when you're doing max velocity training. He thinks to go faster and to relax means to slow down. And that's not what we're saying. And it's really hard to do in another language. And I want to go backwards for a second. I've brought this up before, but I want to just make a point when it comes to Derek's thoughts there. And that is, you've heard me say this, I've stopped using the word jump training, plyometric training, or myometric training, whichever you may choose, and have gone to strictly to bounce training, bouncing off the ground, being reactive. I know some people use reactive. It doesn't work well in other languages, but bounce works really well. It's easy to see, demonstrate, and the word works. Okay, back to speed endurance. So then after that, you have what is an energy system wise, you're moving into a different energy system anyways. So a good part of what we do is lactic endurance, and then we'll get into glycolytic short speed endurance. We'll go from ASSC to GSSC. And then after that, then we're right into lactate energy system training. And, what distance do you need to have to do that? And if you're lucky, you can actually test somebody and kind of figure out where they make that transfer. And if not, then you kind of guess like the rest of us do, and you do what your ex-phys books and all the training manuals show, and you start looking at those 300s and 450s and 500s, and depending on the event, 150s, 180s, 200s, 240s. We use a bunch of different distances. We do a 20-second run, a 40-second run. Some people do 20-second run, 15-second, and then they'll do a 45-second run. I used to do 45-second runs for years, a distance that you run in it. I do use the Cosman test in the 800 and 1,500 meter kids. I found it may not be a great predictor, but it's a great workout. And it's a great session to use if you can't compete. So you throw it in because they run, let's say at 800, they run, 2 400s and as far as they can go in 60 seconds. And then they take a rest and they do it again. That's a pretty good workout, and it's not easy. And someone like Chun Yu, Charlie, the 800 meter runner, she started out at 811 meters. By the end of the year, she was 866 meters.
Wow.
Yeah, she improved 50 meters plus. And that probably won't happen to her again, but that's a sizable improvement, needless to say.
Yeah.
And that predictor at 866, I think, was 154.5 or something like that. She ran 157, which is pretty much what you see. You see about a 3-second difference. Anyways, I'm a little off subject.
Sure.
So next question.
No worries. Yeah. Actually, someone asked this, so I'll just bring it up in the list. I actually may not even have put this on the list. I know someone asked it. And so I'll tie this into what you talked about, top speed, Su relaxing. I'd like to ask you maybe 2 questions here. So with the top speed, one is, how do you go about teaching or communicating relaxation? And then 2, what's your thoughts? Someone asked this, thoughts on wickets, mini hurdles. How do you, or even cones on the ground, sticks, so those 2 things, relaxation, and then any sort of constraint where there's a stick or something on the ground.
Well, I use mini hurdles. I tend to use mini hurdles mostly, but I will use cones if I have a real problem with recovery mechanics in somebody. One of the big issues is that you get too high in your mini hurdles, and you force a high heel recovery, and that's an issue. So 12-inch mini hurdles I rarely, if ever, use. 9-inch on a relatively tall person, we mostly use 6-inch mini hurdles. I start them out at 0.5, or 50 centimeters to 75 centimeters, and we use a bar overhead or out in front, hands on hips, different variations of anything but letting the arms work, so that they have to just let the legs do what they do. And then we start teaching initially just a step down, a reacceleration to the thighs. So we look at trying to establish a cross extensor reflex. What does it feel like to step down, feel the force into the ground, and how that creates the reflex of the leg up? So we'll start very short and just slowly work our way out, because I want to make sure that they understand how to get that big engine that they're blessed with working as well as it should. So for me, it's all about getting that butt working and making sure it works. Then the second part to that is once you get the force into the ground, then you got to bounce off the ground and controlling that bounce, because that's the other side of the reflex action, is controlling that bounce upward and forward and not letting that heel pop up into your butt from behind, but instead let it pop up and forward, so that you rarely get much above a parallel shin in your max velocity mechanics. A little bit, but you try not to get too much. And that's a big deal. And it's very difficult to do.
So with the relaxation element, I mean, what do you actually, because Cody also asked, I mean, maybe this could fit in with this question. I think this is a really interesting one that I'd be asking you as well. But like, because people talk about this with max velocity, is do you have athletes really run 100% versus like 90%? Like when you're actually training max speed, I look at it sometimes the same way as weightlifting. Like, are you going to go in and do 100% versus how relaxed are you? What are you looking for on the times on the given session in terms of their maximal abilities? How do you go about that spectrum of things in top end?
Well, one, we do our flying 30s at 100% when we're testing. And then I use a percent off of that. I rarely go above 95. Sometimes I'll sneak to a 98% when we're doing relay work. And on occasion, I'll go 100% during the relays as well. Because if you don't, you end up screwing it up over on the track later on. A good part of our speed work after we establish technical models and we're functioning and we're performing well is we'll be in ins and outs. And so we're learning how to contract hard and then relax. And through the relaxation, you get faster. And that's how one of the best ways for an athlete to learn. Even kids could do that, once they figure it out. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of the simple way to go about it. With the mini hurdles or any kind of barrier training, that's always done with relaxation as much as possible. So that's why we take and we use tools to stop the arms from working. And we talk about the jaw and we talk about their breathing. And we go through the dynamics of the motion. And then we bring the arms back in and see exactly how well they're able to execute everything with the whole upper body running in a relatively relaxed fashion. And you look back at some of the great sprinters, and most of them ran pretty relaxed. I think if Su ran relaxed, he's probably a 975, 978 guy, somewhere right in there.
With the arms. So do you feel like when I think about like degrees of freedom and you take the arms basically out in whatever, I mean, they're still in it, but they're not, it's a thing that's not moving anymore. Do you feel like that if you're working with athletes who need to be a little bit more relaxed in their upper body in general, by taking the arms out through whatever constraint, that actually allows them to focus more on being able to relax, such as if they were actually swinging their arms and moving them, that might be too many things going on to learn to relax a little bit more? Or what's your thoughts on that?
It's mixed because it is very individualized. That one is. Mm-hmm. There's so many different arm lengths and upper arm lengths and lower arm lengths, so many different ratios. But I do like to take them out. I still like to take them out of the picture. I think it's important to do that. I think it tells the body, oh, I got to figure this out now. I got to figure out how to run. Because you can be a little tense in the upper body and still learn to be relaxed in the lower body. It ain't perfect, but you can do it. And I would prefer to see the lower jaw relax. And there's a whole lot of research that's gone into what's happening with, head positioning, the lower jaw, all the muscles of the neck and how that affects what's going on in the posterior chain and front. So there's a lot of science there that takes a little sitting down to figure it out. But the jaw appears to be the secret. And if you watch Jacobs, he is the best in the world right now at relaxing and running fast, without a doubt. Kid's really good at it. Coleman also. So in terms of drills, we'll do in mirror arm drills where we're looking at very aggressive arms, not so aggressive. We'll pull the exogen on so we can feel the arms, feel them aggressive, feel them not so aggressive. There's a few other things that you can do with kids particularly, but I like using a weighted bar, not very heavy, 2K, 3K, because it then, if you put that out in front of you and hold it overhead or out in front of you, it does bring into play all the muscles of the upper back, lower back, and it makes those things tighten up and have to function. And you got to figure out how to do this with those tight. And you feel that isolated component of what needs to move and what doesn't need to move.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely makes sense with how those constraints are going to cause different muscular adaptations or just different. I always feel like too when with some of the no arms things, especially if the arms, it's a little bit harder I think when they're overhead, but I do think about how when you take the arms out, if they're I don't see this done often, but if you put your arms behind your back and had someone bound, you have to see their spine now has to figure out how to work a little bit more, if you have someone who's just super rigid when they move and things like that. That's been something I've been considering the last couple of years. But it is interesting how that, like you said, it makes the legs work more as well. You're passing the emphasis down to a different part of the body.
Yeah. And that's your goal is to try to selectively let the body figure it out, how it's going to adapt itself to do the right things.
You mentioned this, Randy, and I think this is interesting. So you mentioned, because this doesn't get talked about often, you mentioned time, as opposed to distance. Because almost everyone loves to use distance. It's almost like that's how we're wired, is run this far. How, maybe it's more finite and maybe that's why people like it. But I love the idea of just a time and how far did you go? I know Chris Corfist and Tony Holler and 23-second runs. And I've thought about it's just different mentally too. How would that fit in your program in the sense, would you alternate bi-weekly, every other week it's for time, or how do you split the time up with the distance? And then how do you think that the athlete reacts to that mentally? What are some programming considerations when you're actually going to put in time versus a distance?
I use time strictly for testing with the sprinters. So we'll do the timed runs every 4 weeks or so, 6 weeks, whatever it may be during the time of the year. And then, of course, with the distance and middle distance people, I use time rather than distance. So time at task for them. So for the 20-second and 23-second, whatever thing is that you want to use, I do that as a test. So it's a consistent testing system throughout but in addition to, I keep the 150 as a timed thing. How fast are you in your 150? I know what it means. I think every coach has their own little quirks and experiences that they've become comfortable with. And I'm not going to say that any one is right or wrong, because quite frankly, once you become comfortable with it and it is a way to assess improvement, by all means, as long as you're assessing the right improvements, the test assesses the right things, then by all means use it. Who am I to say that it's right or not? As Brooks Johnson just mentioned the other day, along with another coach, he said, if you're not in the huddle, you don't really know what the play is. It's right. Who knows? It's just such a simple fact. We can all be. I've done it. I continue to do it at times. I catch myself. We're very critical of other coaches. We look at people, look how bad they run, and he's not a good coach. And the fact is, you just don't know what the problems are. there are some common truths if you don't see changes. And if you haven't coached at that level, which both Brooks and I have always agreed on that, if you're not coaching an elite 100-meter guy, you might not yet understand how to coach a 100-meter guy, and there's things, I mean, if you were to stand in a conversation with coaches, you might just go, what in the heck is he talking about? Because you don't know how they have to get to that kid. And it could be completely contrary to what you might imagine. And that's the freedom of coaching and the art of coaching and the way you try to do your best to communicate with somebody what they need to learn. And that's an awkward thing at best anyways, because you're trying to teach something that is really uncomfortable. I mean, max velocity mechanics are not normal. They're not. They're just not, You're going to have to, it's going to take you a few years to get somebody to really get that stuff right.
Got it. I did want to ask you, so you had mentioned like you'll get a 30-meter test, like speaking of testing, and I like how you split that up too. I always am thinking with the way that the run is framed to the athlete is also something mental, like you could have more of a chance or more chances for personal bests, or a different, like from a principles perspective, it could be a different, test to utilize. If you felt like the athlete wasn't going to do very well at like a set distance or something, I could go for time instead and just kind of cycle around to frame their perception. I did want to, or if you had any comments on that, I also wanted to ask you just to confirm, like, so you get that 30-meter test, and then for the next several weeks or whatever, you would run like, all right, we're going to hit about 95%. Like, you're not trying to PR on the fly every week, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
No. I do. I actually only test the 30-meter test at most every 6 weeks, but usually every two months, because then I mean, first of all, it's going to take them a while to make the changes. They're probably not going to get that much faster in that time frame. I do use weight training to hold them back more than I do running to hold them back, to keep them from peaking. So my weight room is a little bit more important. So testing, in a block of training, if you wish to use the term block, in a cycle, you're going to be using that testing time to determine all the rest of your times for some period of time until they adapt. And then you can kind of tell when they're adapting, because they'll start just stabilizing their times in training. And then it's time to retest and get back after it.
I like what you mentioned, because I think that runs counterintuitive to a lot of people, is weight training to hold them back, in the sense of, a lot of people would be like, oh, well, do you want them to be the fastest they can every week? But having gone through track and field and seasons, it's like, then you get it. Just the same way that you said, if you haven't coached 100-meter runners, like when you coach athletes for the whole season, you understand that it's almost like you're giving them somewhere to go. With that, too, I was going to ask, what's your thoughts on the same thing with, like, I mean, obviously junk running is never a good idea, but like the same thing for like tempo, like using tempo or fitness circuits for the same purpose, or is it more like you're thinking of the weightlifting from that perspective?
Well, no, the tempo I use for recovery.
You mentioned that in the last podcast.
Yeah, and same thing with general strength. And I'll actually have I'll throw in a 7 or 10 day cycle of general strength tempo work along the way, just to let them come back up. And then we'll test not the first day, but we'll test the second day after coming off of the regeneration cycle. So I build in a regeneration cycle, and they have to have it. But we're in the pool every day anyways. If we're in the pool or sauna, we're trying to do some pretty aggressive recovery. By aggressive, I don't mean intense. I mean, you're just doing it, and that has helped every athlete that I've worked with, all of them that get over 28 years of age. They just love the pool, and some don't like water, but they love the pool and what it does to their bodies and how they feel. I mean, you put a football player in the pool after a game, it's a completely different guy the next day. If you do it for 2 days, they're going to be pretty happy, because by Thursday, you're going to have a game again on Sunday or Saturday or Friday night, whatever. By that time period, that 2 or 3 day regeneration while they're coming back, their bodies are going to feel so much better than they had prior to that. So, I mean, I think it's across the board, from Gretzky to Eller to Armstrong to Kirby, all these guys I worked with back in the day in football and hockey and basketball across the board. Like, I wish I'd known about this when I was 21, 22 years old, because it would have changed my career.
Yeah. It is interesting to me, like I'm like almost the worst person to administer all these questions, because I just get, I'm like, I can't just go down the list. I'm like, I have to keep like, what about this? But I do find it interesting, because I think I think it's a lot more common, at least on the high school level, as per my perception, that, if people are using fly sprints, kids go as fast as they can every week. And it seems like sprinters are wired to want to do that. It's like the same way, almost like, you could say teenage boys, they're on bench press, they want to max out every time they go in, which, we obviously, we want to build, like, that's almost like the instinct, right? And so how do you still motivate athletes for that session, in the sense of, it's very inherently motivating if, like, I'm running the fly and I want a PR this week, like, yeah, like, how do you keep them motivated, or how do you frame that session when it's like, no, it's like, it's 95%, it's X amount of reps. Like, how do you keep that, or put that in perspective, when that desire or drive is probably going to be, I want to see how fast I am today,
Well, I wouldn't be doing it every week, because that's just a recipe for hamstring injuries. And of course, at the same point, you're doing it every week in high school anyways, because your preseason's about 3 weeks long, and then you got to meet.
Yeah, 2 meets a week or whatever.
Let's go.
You're still
and of course, all of course, all the meets are regular distances. They're not shortened, unless you've got a very wise initial relay competition that somebody's smart enough to, shorten a hurdle race, or shorten, do 60s instead of hundreds, and, do 150s instead of 200s, just so people don't get hurt. But the problem is, everybody's trying to qualify, and they're trying to do this and that. And it's like, man, if they were doing this right, you wouldn't be forcing the high school season to be ridiculously short in some states. I mean, in a state like Idaho, where I am, it is, I think their state meet is the second week in May. Heck, wow. Some places during certain years, you just got 4 weeks since you got the snow off the track. I mean, you still have a lot of time. So there's the high school year, and for guys that are successful at the high school level, you got to take their hats off to them, because it is extremely difficult to do without getting a whole lot of people hurt. It is. You just have to. You can't sprint them as hard as you would an elite athlete. And we always have to be careful that when you ask me a question, I'm got my elite hat on, and I got to take it off and rethink it, because the worst mistake we can make is superimpose elite athlete training on youth, middle school or high school, for that matter, even college, the first few years.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting world. The high school track world is one that I have less experience in, but as I'm learning more about it, I'm like, man, this could be, it's a really compressed situation. I do need to kind of keep rolling here, because I have so many questions here. So Ryan Banta wants to know, how has your training evolved over the years? Has there ever been any keystone moments where you're doing it a certain way and like, okay, now I'm going to shift over and evolving to a different direction? So how has your training evolved as a coach over the years?
Isn't really much, to be honest. I was lucky enough to have pretty good mentors, and I started out, in women's gymnastics. So probably the biggest change for me was discovering Keiser. Weight training changed some, but I studied it a lot. In terms of the track, I'd say becoming more efficient at what the drilling means, and making the drilling have more meaning, and being able to integrate the drilling into actual sprinting, and figuring out how to do that. Although that's an ongoing problem for every coach that lives. So I've always been of the mind to establish a technical model, then condition the model. So that hasn't changed in me since the beginning of my coaching. There haven't been many aha moments. I mean, I was always kind of away from everybody else. Winkler was in Florida and Illinois, and Lauren and Dan were down at LSU, and John was at UCLA, and Bobby, and a lot of the guys. And I was up in Oregon or away And I was in Fresno or wherever it may be. And I was never really integrated into that whole scene. So I was free to do and find, because I didn't run track. So for me, it was my own observations and then pulling from various sources, whether it was gymnastics, volleyball, dance. My warm up comes from Steve Sutich. I mean, good part of it from the UCLA volleyball warm up back in the 70s, early 70s. They were the first ones doing a dynamic warm up. It was amazing to watch. And that was a pretty good aha moment, probably, if you had to take one. And I remember telling Steve this a few years back. He's in Portland. And I told him, I said, the basis of my warm up comes from UCLA volleyball and doing a class with him, doing a seminar with Steve in the mid 70s. So, running mechanics wise, obviously seeing what Lauren and Kevin did, it makes you rethink things, listening to different people. And then, of course, then you're developing your own thoughts and concepts tactically within races, figuring out, this, if you don't want to use the word drive phase, you don't have to, but acceleration drive phase and what it means and where it is and where you take it to and how you transition smoothly through the whole race. So there, although you may teach it in parts, the race itself isn't in parts, that kind of thing. And I don't know if that answers Ryan's question, but it's, I've been pretty solid in the way that I've done things for a long time. And what it's turned out to be is that people are catching up now. They're asking about Keiser. They're asking about drills. I've been using mini hurdles since the 80s, so this isn't new stuff for me. This is stuff I've done all along. Well, I would say with Bowden, I forget Bowden's last name. Bowden introduced me to the activator belt in Australia. That was a big moment. That was like Keiser, understanding how to utilize the activator belt and how to make it work for me. He didn't know how I would use it, but I see things and I look. So when you ask that question, I look at the tools I use and go, how am I going to utilize that tool to help the athlete? And that's where it becomes fun and creative. Shuttle MVP, hex bars, safety squat bars, Keiser racks, sleds, different, exogen, different tools we've used along the way. That's probably been the biggest thing for me, is the external tools that I've been able to get my hands on to help me evaluate what I'm doing and make me more accountable for what I'm doing with the athlete.
Cool. Moving along here, try to knock this list out. Bob Ramsey asks, how do you teach acceleration mechanics to athletes who do not yet have the lower leg strength or power to support more optimal acceleration patterns?
A question. Yes. That's a good question. It's, you're going to have to find some way to resist them. It can't be the same resistance as a heavy sled, but you can do a pulley system of some sort. You can use the sled with a little bit less weight with some kind of body support, somebody supporting them. You tend to find this mostly more in really young men and young women. They just don't have the body strength yet. And of course, the simple answer is get them stronger, for God's sakes. This is why I said earlier, sometimes you have to get strong in order to do the minimum technical model. And, this is where the Europeans were so far ahead of us early on, and, circuit training and general strength and all that. They were doing that with kids, and we've lost PE in the school. Poor coaches today, they're getting kids that just don't have the ability to do some basic things. Feel for them, because it's not easy. Yeah, it's getting in the blocks is another issue. I tend to elongate the blocks before I shorten the blocks. I think giving them a higher or a greater knee-thigh angle so that they can actually push and be in a position where their legs can push. Will it slow them down a little bit for a while? It may, but that's okay. How many of the kids in a high school track team are going to get a college scholarship? And the ones that are going to probably go to get a college scholarship are probably going to be strong enough. And the ones that aren't, they're there to have fun and enjoy track and field. And that's exactly what you want them to do, because you want them walking away with the memories of accomplishing things they didn't think they could accomplish.
Okay, next question. So Elias Stahl asks, what is your procedure of gathering information to guide training decisions? Or what, I guess in other words, what key data points, and Elias asks, what key metrics are you using when you're gathering the data to guide your training process?
Ooh, that's a big question.
Yeah, just like the weightlifting one, right?
Oh, yeah. The simple answer is certain tests. Flying 30 is my big test. Acceleration 20 or acceleration 15. So I use those to determine. I still use the distance of the seventh step. I don't plan it, but I do want to know what it is. And then depending upon whether they're doing the appropriate mechanics before that, we'll take a look at how we make that. We need to make that either grow or shorten depending upon how they are executing their first 7 steps. So in metrics, I use free lap quite a bit. I use the Brower system. In the long jump, I still use the Brower. I don't use the free lap. We are using force platforms more now than we have, that we didn't have them before. I use OptiJump for looking at that. I use, obviously, the sports science people, Dr. Mann, Dr. Ralph Mann back in the day. I used Yu Bing and Dr. Hay in the jumps, and a few others that would help out. Metrics, I used a sports psychologist, and you may not think of that as a metric, but it is for me. Use VMAX Pro, GymAware, Tendo, Keiser in the weight room. So the key metrics, are I still look at the squat, and I look at the clean. I don't look at the weight of the clean. I look at the power the clean's creating. I do look at push jerks as well. And of course, on Keiser, I'm getting power output in every lift anyways. So that's constant monitoring. And the guys get used to it too. So everybody, by guys, I mean men and women, get used to being able to see that and get after it. It creates a more motivated athlete when they can see that power number. But like I said, 20-second and 45-second test or 40-second test depends on. I actually do those two differently depending on the athletes. 100 guys getting the 40 and the 200 guys getting the 45. So whether that 5 seconds makes a big difference or not, who knows? It's just something I've kind of always done. And I may not have a good answer for that.
Sure. Sounds like, yeah, I'd imagine that someone like Su, a sprinter like Su, probably wouldn't like the 45-second test that much.
No, he won't. He won't do it. I don't take him past the 20-second test. He doesn't do the 40-second test. He just, there's just no reason for him to get that. The 20 is good enough for him. And in his case, we'll do time 150s, time 120s, time 90s for a speed endurance style test. So, because he's only got to run 100 meters.
Gotcha. I would say quickly the flying test. I know fly 10s is pretty common, and you use fly 30s. Do you feel like, is that more the 30, more the level of athlete that you're at, like an elite? Would you use a shorter distance with younger athletes or people who aren't quite as fast, or does that not really matter with what you're looking for out of that?
It's hard. I know how it works with these guys because we use a genoptic laser on them too. So I know where they hit their max velocities. And I want the test to be within that range. So, and I want them to be able to hold it a little bit. So for these guys, the majority of them are hitting their max velocity somewhere between 45 and 60 meters, some a little bit past that. So we'll do a 30-meter acceleration, which is a standard that you can look up kind of around the world too. So you can look back and see what people were doing for their 30-meter acceleration times. And then the flying 30 becomes that ability to see your max velocity expressed a little bit longer, meaning you have it a little bit more. I would, for younger, 10 meter and 20 meter for sure. They're just, for the younger kids, if we do a flying 30, we do 20 meter run in because they're already accelerated. Their acceleration is so poor that they have already hit top speed by 20 meters, in some cases. But I see no problem with it. And particularly if you've got years of data on it, why not? the chances with a younger person doing a flying 30, injury potential goes up as you do a flying 30 as well. So you got to have a well-conditioned or a smart athlete who understands technically what to do. That's why I don't test flying 30 for quite a while in the year.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, with the younger, go a little bit shorter for sure. So Dylan Rowe asks your thoughts. I find this interesting because I saw this video and we talked about assisted overspeed or whatever or not. Thoughts on that? And Dylan Rowe asks, what are your thoughts on Marcell Jacobs, the wind tunnel training? So running behind the bike or the car with the windshield where he doesn't have any wind resistance. Thoughts on stuff like that?
Well, I think it's great. I liked it the first time I saw it. And, back in the old days, Tony Wells would pull people with his Volkswagen and, he had a bar attached to it and he'd pull them. And I think with the horse trailer back behind the car, it gives him the opportunity to run so relaxed, and it's proven itself. And I like it. We've differentiated assisted versus overspeed. I start assisted training at the average velocity that they would achieve in 100 meters. So if they run 10 flat, they're average at 10 meters per second. And then I move it up 2 to 3 meters per second. That's using the 1080 over time. And not very, they get through the first part of it pretty quick because they have to be a little bit slower in their acceleration or they'll run out of it. But then we'll assist up to what we see as the maximum velocity they achieve in their race. And typically it's 11.5 to 11.8 meters per second, faster for some. But there aren't many people going that. Overspeed, I tried it, don't like it. It scares me, and the wheels are going to come off eventually if you're not careful with it. So I'd rather use assisted speed and slowly get towards that limit of pushing their speed. Now, mind you, as they go through the year, they get faster, and so your assisted speed becomes faster as the year goes on. So I use wind to their back. That's one of the best overspeed, assisted speed things you can possibly do. Just let them run with the wind and relax and go. You look how fast they run, because I can tell you when people get wind-aided times, they're in overspeed. Mm-hmm. They're in overspeed. So go for it.
Yeah, I think Hank Krajinoff had said something like that. Like, it's just the simplest form of overspeed there is. It's almost like, I think it's funny. It's almost like we're always looking for the tool, the technology that will help us do something, which obviously there's great technology out there, Keisers and things, but it's like, well, wind is free. It's nature. So nature's pretty, you feel like there's probably a pretty natural response to nature versus if perhaps you're getting towed too fast, right? And you have to start to run unnaturally to deal with that. It makes sense to me that would be a better way to do it.
If you're ever down in Chula Vista and it's 3:00 in the afternoon, you can do overspeed training with wind real easy. Now you just got a wind tunnel out there. So that's why all the vaulters like to come there and jump at 3 p.m. because you just get this wind and it's perfect. It's just a beautiful wind, and it's wind is your friend if you can use it. It can be your enemy too, obviously, but most places in this country, you end up with a windy day or windy days, and you can utilize that wind very easily for doing assisted, relaxed sprint training.
There was a video of, I don't know how long, maybe 10 years ago or whatever. Justin, they had, it was in Japan, I think. They had Justin Gatlin running the 100, and they had these huge wind turbines behind him. I think he ran like a 9.3.
Yeah.
I wish.
Right.
I was curious. I'd be curious to see the mechanics, that he used relative to. Like, at what point does it become extreme, right? Because that's about half second faster than he was running in the 100. And so it I don't know, it's just interesting to me. I want to go back and look at that one now with the wind versus, pulling with a belt, different story. But, just that interesting stuff to me.
Yeah. And I think that with what Jacobs is doing with the trailer behind the car is perfect. It's a great session. And I wish we could do more of it,
Yeah, it's just a little more specialized. It's a little more expensive to get that than, just go out and have the wind at your back for sure. Not quite as accessible.
Yeah. Although I'm sure there's probably plenty of dads walking around with trailers they aren't using, that could be built out, and I wouldn't be doing it with high school, but I certainly with the elite kids, an electric cart that can get fast enough, and that would be a great training tool.
Yeah.
So, and if you're going to be competing with those guys that are using those tools and they're working, you better find a way to either duplicate that tool, or duplicate what the tool is doing, or duplicate the tool. Take your pick, because there's the old book: if it ain't broke, break it. Somebody's going to break it. Somebody's going to find a way to do it. And in this case, the relaxation that comes with taking the wind away, and I mean, it's sucking you along. That thing's just sucking him along, is what it's doing. And I really like the use of it.
Cool. It makes me think too about the value of various overspeed tools as a function of how much relaxation they can induce. It's like if you're getting pulled by a cord too fast, that almost seems like something that your brain would be going in a little bit of a threat, and it could make you be a little actually more tense than what might be good for you relative to the wind pushing you or not having wind resistance.
Well, you might remember that we talked about it, but with the 1080, we actually measure that. And so when you're looking at a 1080 readout, you can see how much force is being put into the ground when you do assisted. And if it gets over 40, we stop. We don't go any faster. That's just 40's we figured out 40 was about where it needs to be. And so if you're doing assisted speed or overspeed, whichever, if you start getting a braking force that's greater than 40, you need to shut it down. And in women, it's less than that. So
cool. So for these last few questions, just got a few more here. Why don't you, and this will be cool because you mentioned using strength training to hold people back a little bit earlier in the year. So once you get in season or you're trying to go fast, what are the key components that change for in-season strength for your groups?
We just check the intensity stays high and the volume drops. So it's not terribly complicated. It's just, now you start to, because if you're lifting, you're keeping the central nervous system basically suppressed. And so you start coming off, drop the volume down, and you keep the intensity high. You use it to neurologically pump it up and stop suppressing it. And now they're able to express the coordination and everything, because when they're lifting, their coordination is going to be less than. And when they start to peak and you're lifting less until you're completely off lifting for a very, very short amount of time, but now your coordination, your nervous system is on, and you're ready to go. So you take away the suppression of your CNS.
Got it. 2 questions left here for you, Randy. Joe's Juice says, how much of a premium do you put on strength development with underdeveloped or weaker athletes? And maybe I can tack on just a little bit, is if an athlete is weaker in the gym or from a muscular perspective, do you have them do any more lifting than anyone else, or how does playing to one's strengths fit in? If someone's really elastic, playing to their elastic strengths, if someone's naturally stronger, playing to their stronger strengths, and those types of things. So yeah,
it's it's a great question, and there's not a specific answer for that one. It's because it's a really big, another big question, because it depends on obviously age, the elasticity, the anatomical factors involved in that athlete, training age. So in general, and I've got a kid right now who's really elastic, and most of the Chinese are very elastic because that's what they do a lot of. They do a lot of mild jump training, a lot of moderate interval training. So they get pretty elastic, but they have no power from the force side. So they never get to get power from the force. They get power from the speed side, but without producing force at high speeds. So, you got to put them back. You just got to get them in the weight room. In the case of this particular kid I have right now, I actually put him in hypertrophy, which I really don't do very often with sprinters. But this kid needed it, and then he started to thrive because what he needed was hypertrophy. And did I know he needed hypertrophy? I kind of guessed he did, but when we started looking at his ability to display power, it was just we just couldn't do it. And so we had to do, if you look back on just old research, even you see that the first thing is still to try to create a little bit muscle diameter size, change that size a little bit, and you do that for a short amount of time just to get that prepared to then get into the real training that's necessary to improve performance. So I don't shy away from it. I get them in the weight room and make them and get them stronger and more powerful.
Got it. Yeah, it makes sense that, especially for like a really elastic athlete. I mean, muscle offers compression. Muscle mass and tissue offers the opportunity for, compression and pressure changes as well. And like, I always think that there's a lot of facets to how we work. And with the hypertrophy too, like you were saying that you wouldn't do that for long. Like, I mean, obviously there comes a point where like, okay, you have enough muscle. Like how would you assess like how long that individual is going to be doing that type of training? And then are there like markers you're looking at along the way from like a reactivity perspective or anything like that? Or is it not even that complicated in the way that you look at it?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be that complicated, but if we're doing it, I would do 1 day a week over a 3-week cycle. We do 2 cycles, and it's not a steady diet of it. It's just you substitute one training session in the weight room with a little more hypertrophy stuff to try to get this kid to create a better cross-sectional area so he can express more force to go along with that great elasticity that he has.
Yeah, just 1 day a week. That makes, it's almost like that minimal dose. Yeah. Not going to go crazy. I'd be 3 days a week bodybuilding split. It's just 1 day a week for a few cycles.
Yeah.
All right. Last question. I still had a few more, but I think this will round it out here. So Johan asks, gosh, this could be another whole show. Hamstring training and how to reduce hamstring injuries. Just some major principles that you look at when it comes to the whole hamstring world. Maybe if you can throw in your thoughts on Nordics there, that's like a hot button thing. So we'll take that one.
Yeah.
Hamstring injury training.
We tried Nordics more than once in my lifetime, and basically people got injured doing them. It's too much for a track athlete unless you're not doing hardly any running at all. We used to use the glute ham gastroc raise, which is essentially Nordics, but we do those, a lot in the fall. One of the things that concerns me is all that stuff is slow, and people talk about the hamstrings are isometric and when they're doing this and that, and when you hit the ground, I use the Keiser leg curl, fast, really fast. I mean, a guy like Su can put 80 kilos on there and he's producing, 2,000 watts of power now. When he started out, it was like 700 watts of power. So we're doing it fast, and it certainly takes care of the lower end. You can make a case that it doesn't take care of the upper end, but I do something else for the upper end of the hamstrings. So, and that's kind of a myth anyways, but it's an easy thing to communicate. So, and we rarely get hamstring injuries. I've had more in China than I've ever had before because everything they did was front side. Everything that they were doing, they weren't taking care of the hamstrings at all. Their hips were locked up. There's a lot of reasons why they were having so much trouble with their hamstrings. So if you're dealing with youth, do Nordics with body weight. I mean, of course, it's not a problem. I just wouldn't make a steady diet out of it with elites because it's, I think it sets them up for a little bit of injury given the intensity we work at.
Yeah, that makes sense. People have really, it's interesting. I've heard a bunch of stuff. People like, Nordics are amazing. And then I've heard a lot of stuff. No, they aren't. They aren't very good. And I mean, I think that you have different elements that you can look at on either side. But like you're saying, I had good success. My first year as a strength coach at Cal, my first couple of years, there was a sprinter who had been plagued with hamstring injuries and was pretty fast in high school, 10.6, 10.7 guy in high school, and ran like 10.8 there his first 2 years. And then I got there, and one of the strategies we actually found to be And of course, yeah, right. Who knows? Like, there's so many factors, right? Like you said, you're at like tight hips, you have tight shoulders, you don't rotate well enough. Like, there's X, Y, Z. But we microdose Nordics, like one set of 3 a day or something like that, and that actually worked. For our understanding, that actually worked pretty well. But it makes me think, like JB Morin talked about, like you get similar adaptations in the hamstrings from high speed sprinting as you do Nordics. Like they're both really intense things. So it just makes sense to me. Yeah, if you got someone who can run really fast and you're doing something in the weight room that's also really intense, that's a lot that's being demanded out of that muscle group. That's for sure.
It is. And then if you start drilling, if you use the activator belt and some other things, and you're drilling and you're purposely looking and trying to get them to get that glute involved in the hip extension to the ground, when that foot hits the ground, the forces on that hamstring are amazing. So you're getting a Nordic with every footstep.
Yeah.
It's not a bent knee Nordic necessarily.
I think it would be would be helpful for, I know I've changed in the sense, like I don't have as much in the track programs I write, and even a lot of general workout programs I write. I don't have as much hamstring or accessory hamstring as quite as I used to, just because I have done, the podcast, and I've the understanding of, you're getting this when you sprint, and if the kinetic chain has a good pattern to it, you're getting good hamstring training just by going out and running and sprinting. Like that is hamstring training. So it's like, well, I want to then optimize the kinetic chain and just make sure. And the thought of just because I'm hitting the hamstrings more on top of the sprinting I'm doing, I just want to be careful. It's not like it doesn't become a thing where I guess just more is more. I'm trying to figure out a fancier term in my head, but I just think it's easy to pile on stuff.
I mean, in the fall, we'll do, weighted glute ham eccentric drops. I mean, essentially a Nordic. But if that was the key for being fast and performance, Sue would have a hard time with 15 kilos. And I would put my female long jumper on there and she's knocking out 35 kilos, like nothing. And the guys are just staring at her like, what are you made of? Because we can't do that, and yet one could run 11.6, the other can run, 10.0. I like it for injury prevention, but the Keiser moving fast and powerfully, you're getting a really nice injury prevention thing going on there. Use any of the drilling when your foot is hitting the ground. You're getting it there. And see, when I look at drilling, I don't necessarily look at drilling strictly technically. I look at drilling as is creating the environment for all the small muscles and all the muscles to basically develop around the pattern of movement, around each joint's pattern of movement that's necessary for max velocity.
Yeah, it's good stuff. It makes me think too, about the hamstring. It's really, and I love the high velocity adaptation, and just thinking about the hamstring is designed for speed. And so it makes, like you said with Sue versus the 11.6 runner, who could crush it at the Nordics, whereas Sue might not be as good. If it was just 1-to-1 like that, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I like what you're saying with you treating the hamstring as a velocity muscle with the Keiser, and realizing that it's meant for velocity at the end of the day. It has to do and control.
A velocity and the end product, it's going to get injured in two places: at ground contact or at apex of flexion on the front side, where the lower leg is your hamstring is trying to deaccelerate the lower leg. So we do exercises, let's say with the Keiser FT or a cable machine, where we're in full flexion and we're doing pulls, hamstring pulls, standing up on one leg, and trying to strengthen and feel what that's going to feel like in a position that they're in. So we do a lot of different hamstring exercises, but not one of them is a huge part of our training.
Got it. For people, this is probably complicated like the first one, but maybe I'll leave with this is, if someone didn't have a Keiser leg curl type machine, I mean, are there any other fast, common hamstring exercises that people do? I mean, I've seen reactive glute ham raises, things like that. Is there any other piece of equipment in the gym that you feel like just done at high velocity can offer some or elicit some similar type training effects?
Probably bands would do it. But you're you get the wrong strength curve in a band.
Yeah.
We've always done rolling the med ball down the legs and flicking it. And that's a pretty good one for young kids to do.
Yeah, totally.
So you just roll it down the back of their legs and they flick it up. And so that's speed, and there's a little bit of force takes place at the end of that long lever. So that's not easy. Doing med ball kicks, rear kicks, standing. So you're standing up and you take a med ball and you basically pull it backwards with a straight leg. So you're getting that hamstring is getting an isometric contraction while it's, the glutes moving it. Straight leg runs, I think, are a great effective tool. And now with the estrogen, you add on a little bit of resistance to the bottom or whatever weight. You just don't want to use a heavy weight, but whatever weight you need so that you're creating stress way up at the high end of that lever. And when it hits the ground, one, it's accelerating to the ground, but then two, when it hits the ground, the muscles is going to think, I'm still trying to contract to move this, but whoop, stop. I just got stopped completely. And that's where, from a science standpoint, you start investigating active myosin and the sliding element theory. But then not now, but for a while, there's been also titin as a tissue, which is helical in nature, which surrounds that. And that now becomes your elastic part of this. So a lot of people really want to learn more about that, is really start looking up titin and see what it does in the muscle cell.
Yeah. Yeah, good stuff, Randy. That med ball flick, I love that. I actually use that with swimmers. So I stopped working with track a few years into Cal and switched over to swim. And I use that all the time, the lying flick and then the standing flick, because you're kind of fitting with two, like the up kick and the down kick in the pool. But like I remember one of the first times we did it in the weight room with the women's team, some girl, after this, I always had a very thorough catching the ball, because the partner needs to catch the ball when you're lying on your stomach and the person flicks it up. Anyways, this one girl, long story short, she flicked it and hit herself right in the head and then ended up in the sports medicine room for at least a few minutes. She was fine. But after that, I think I made a rule where you had to stand over the other person instead of at their side, or with that group at least. But when you're doing that the first time, you place your hands in the appropriate position, because there's been too many people who've been mildly damaged with that ball hitting them in certain anatomical areas that are not meant to be hit. So, but it's a great exercise. It's an easy one to use, and you can start them with a 2 kilo and do a 3 and then do a 4. For the bigger kids. I've always liked it, and I think it's pretty appropriate. Awesome. Well, good stuff, Randy. I had probably about 10 more questions, 15 more, but we've gone such a long time. And plus I don't help by asking all these, different directions of each question, but I'm so thankful for the time that you spent with us before you're, flying back out to China to get this in. And I'm sure everyone who asked the questions are really grateful as well.
Well, hopefully, it's hard to be specific and vague at the same time, because the questions sort of, there's only vague answers that you can give, because you start, you ask a question, there can be 100 ideas start running in your mind real quick, but you're like, well, what if this and what if that? And you go, I better not talk about that because there's too many variables in some of these questions to answer them honestly. And I try to tell you what I was doing, and hopefully that was communicated good enough or well enough. And they're welcome to email me. I'm going to be in 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks of quarantine. So send me some questions. I'm not going to have much to do for 3 weeks in China.
Yeah, it sounds good. I'm sure people have plenty of questions to send you. So, and keep you busy in quarantine. Okay. So thanks again, all right, Randy.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to another show. If you enjoy this podcast series and what we're doing, you can help us out by leaving us a rating or a review on iTunes, Spotify, whatever you're listening to this podcast series on. It would really help us out. We'll see you guys next week with another great guest.